There are small changes in the body that often go unnoticed, simply because they happen so subtly. A slight slip when holding a glass, a moment of forgetting a word mid-sentence, or a smile that seems a little uneven. Older adults often tell themselves it's just a part of aging, that a little rest will make it go away. I've heard things like that many times from people who still believe they're healthy and have nothing to worry about. But I'm a neurologist, and I know that these small things are sometimes the very first warning signs. In my 18 years of working with older adults in the US, I've learned one thing: the brain never stays silent for no reason. It may send warnings through very subtle signs so gentle and so easy to confuse with ordinary fatigue. Not every stroke starts with the dramatic signs we often imagine, like intense headache, full paralysis, or fainting. Sometimes, it begins with a moment of odd stillness, or an eye movement that doesn't feel quite right. And just a few minutes later, everything can change completely. I've seen many cases like that, but there is one I will never forget. It was Mr. William, 72 years old, living in a quiet suburb in Ohio. A cheerful, sharp-minded man, with no known chronic illness, and always the heart of the family's laughter. That afternoon, he was still telling jokes at his granddaughter's birthday party, just like always. And then, just a moment after a laugh, he collapsed at the dining table before anyone had a chance to understand what had just happened. That afternoon, Mr. William and his family were celebrating the 6th birthday of his youngest granddaughter. The small kitchen was filled with laughter, the smell of baked cake, and the warmth of a simple family gathering. Mr. William sat at the head of the table as usual, retelling a funny story he had told many times before. Everyone laughed not because the story was new, but because the way he told it made everyone feel at ease. And then, just as everyone was still laughing with him, he suddenly went quiet. He didn't collapse right away, didn't scream, and didn't show any sign of pain. He just sat still, slightly leaning forward, with his left hand limp and his eyes staring blankly at a spot in front of him. His wife thought he was pretending to be serious to add to the joke, so she gently touched his shoulder and called his name. But he didn't respond. His daughter stood up, came closer, leaned in, and began to panic when she saw his dazed eyes and his mouth slightly open but unmoving. The kitchen gradually fell silent, as if all the sound had been drained, because no one understood what was happening. One of the grandchildren quickly called 911, and I was the doctor alerted by the hospital near his home. On my way there, I asked the family over the phone, was he able to speak at that moment? Did he move his arms or legs? Was his face drooping? All the answers were not sure because everything happened so fast, and no one had seen any clear symptoms. Mr. William arrived at the hospital conscious but unable to speak, with almost no response in his left arm. A brain scan confirmed he had just experienced a transient ischemic attack, also known as a TIA, and it was progressing into a full stroke. When we reviewed the home camera footage, we discovered that he had actually paused mid-sentence about 30 minutes earlier, as if searching for a word he couldn't recall. No one noticed at the time, because he still smiled and continued telling his story a few seconds later. Just one small sign, a brief pause, but that was the brain's first knock on the door, sounding the alarm. If someone had noticed then and taken him for a checkup immediately, he might not have had to stay in the hospital for weeks afterward with half his body weakened. I still vividly remember the blank look in his eyes as he tried to pronounce a word, but his mouth didn't follow his command. It was no longer the gaze of a storyteller, it was the gaze of a man who had just lost control of his own body. Many people have asked me whether there's a way to know if a stroke is about to happen. The answer is, yes, and it's called TIA, an extremely important signal the brain sends out. TIA stands for transient ischemic attack. It's a type of mini-stroke, occurring when blood flow to the brain is briefly interrupted for a very short time. Unlike a full stroke, a TIA usually doesn't cause permanent brain damage if treated in time. But here's what worries me most: most people who experience a TIA don't even realize they've just had a major warning sign. That's because the symptoms of a TIA often last only a few minutes, then disappear as if nothing ever happened. The person may only feel slightly slurred speech, a bit of numbness in one hand, or brief loss of balance, then go back to normal. And when everything seems back to normal, they often assume nothing serious occurred. That's exactly how many people lose their golden opportunity to act before a real stroke strikes. Statistics show that about 1 in 3 people who experience a TIA will have a full-blown stroke within days or weeks. The highest risk is in the first 48 hours after a TIA, which means the race against time begins the moment the first signal appears. If a stroke is like a massive storm, then a TIA is the first passing breeze, gentle, but never to be ignored. I once had an elderly patient tell me, "Doctor, I think my brain just froze for a few seconds." But that few seconds of freezing was the brain silently crying for help. TIA doesn't cause pain and doesn't always come with dramatic symptoms like people expect. That's why I always encourage older adults to listen more carefully to their bodies, especially when something feels off, even for a moment. If we can recognize the signs in time and call for help quickly, the bigger damage may never need to happen. Because when we catch the brain's call early, we can preserve our ability to speak, to walk, and to keep the quality of life we've built. If you've ever thought that a stroke only happens when you can't move, when the mouth droops completely, or when someone faints, then we might be missing the very first signs, where everything is so small, so quiet. One of the earliest signs is mild speech difficulty, not total loss of speech, but suddenly pausing mid-sentence or struggling to find a familiar word. Some people describe it as talking and then forgetting what I was saying, or wanting to speak but the mouth just won't cooperate. If this happens while you're fully awake, especially when you are not tired, don't dismiss it as forgetfulness. Pause for a few minutes, breathe deeply, and ask a loved one to check for other signs. Because the brain might be sending you its very first quiet signal. Similarly, mild numbness on one side, hand, leg, or face is often mistaken for a pinched nerve or poor sitting posture. But if that feeling happens suddenly, without pain, and disappears after a few minutes, then you should be cautious. I always advise older adults, even one strange numb spell is worth telling your doctor, because the brain never sends useless signals. This isn't about fear, it's about listening to yourself. Another sign easily overlooked is momentary arm weakness. For instance, holding a bowl of soup and suddenly your hand wobbles or nearly drops it for no clear reason. Many think they're just clumsy, but if that's never happened before, don't be so quick to blame aging. If your muscles aren't slowly weakening over time, but suddenly feel weak in a moment, the problem might lie in the command center, the brain. In that case, stop all activity, sit still, and observe your body for a few minutes. I once treated a woman who said she nearly dropped a bottle of milk while reaching into the fridge and just thought, "My arm must be weak these days." That was actually the start of a TIA. Luckily, her son noticed and took her to the hospital that same night. Another often missed symptom is sudden blurred vision in one eye, like a thin curtain of fog being drawn across. If it lasts only a few minutes before clearing up, you might think it's eye fatigue or dryness from poor sleep. But vision and brain circulation are tightly linked. If one eye goes blurry, it's possible blood flow to that area is being temporarily blocked. I always tell older patients, when one eye suddenly goes blurry, stop reading, stop walking, and call someone. Because in that moment, your body is prioritizing survival for your brain, and everything else should pause. Lastly, one subtle but very important sign is a sudden sense of mental blankness, like standing in the kitchen and forgetting what you were about to do. Not typical forgetfulness, but a moment of disconnection, feeling lost inside your own home. If your mind freezes for a few seconds, if you lose orientation or can't name a familiar object, that's no longer just aging. At that point, don't blame yourself for being forgetful. Instead, be still for a moment and consider that this might be your chance to stop something worse. Because a stroke doesn't always strike like thunder, sometimes it just knocks softly in a moment when we no longer recognize ourselves. There's one very small thing I always hope older adults will remember each day, a quick check to see if your brain is doing okay. No machines needed, no nurse needed, just 1 minute, right at home. We call it FAST, a screening tool used by doctors in the US whenever a stroke is suspected. FAST doesn't just mean fast in English, it's also an acronym for 4 very simple, easy to remember steps. F stands for face your facial muscles, try smiling, then look closely in the mirror. If you notice one side of your face slightly drooping, or your smile looks uneven, this could be an early sign of facial nerve damage. It doesn't cause pain, so it's often overlooked unless observed carefully. Next is A, arms. Stretch both arms straight out in front of you and hold them there for a few seconds. If one arm drops down, or doesn't stay level with the other, your brain might be struggling to control one side of your body. Just a few seconds of this simple test can help detect a problem before it becomes serious. S stands for speech. Say a short sentence, like the sky is beautiful today or I'm feeling okay. If the sentence is broken, slurred, slowed down, or if you can't find the right words, that's a clear signal the brain's language function is being disrupted. Many think they're just tired or a little confused, but this could actually be a sign of a TIA. And T stands for time. If any of the above signs appear, don't wait, call 911 immediately. Because in emergency medicine in the US, there's a phrase we repeat constantly: time is brain. With every passing minute without treatment, millions of brain cells may suffer permanent damage. I always tell my patients, if you're alert enough to suspect something's wrong, that's exactly the time to ask for help. You don't need to wait for someone to confirm it. You don't need to be sure it's a stroke to dial 911. The sooner you call, the greater your chance of recovery and the lower the risk of paralysis, speech loss, or lifelong care dependency. Beyond the FAST test, I recommend forming a morning habit: stand in front of the mirror, smile, raise both arms, and say a simple sentence. It takes only 30 seconds, but it's a proactive way to check your brain before stepping out for the day. If anything feels off, jot it down or tell someone you trust. Don't keep it to yourself hoping it'll go away. And if you live alone, consider installing a medical alert device or having a trusted friend on call just in case. We can't always know what tomorrow brings, but we can choose how we respond to protect the quality of life we still have. Because sometimes, just one small action like calling 911 in time can save the rest of your life. I want to tell you 2 stories that happened just 1 week apart, but the outcomes were as different as night and day. The first is Mr. Charles, 75 years old, living in a small town in Oregon, a calm man who enjoys reading the morning paper and playing Sudoku every evening. One morning, while making coffee, he felt a slight numbness in his lips and noticed that his right hand trembled more than usual in holding the cup. He paused. He didn't rush to continue, nor did he reassure himself with "maybe I just didn't sleep well." He called his son, who lived just 2 blocks away, and said, "Son, something feels a little off this morning. Not like usual." His son, already familiar with the FAST test, arrived within 5 minutes and noticed that his father's smile was slightly uneven. Just 15 minutes later, Mr. Charles was taken to the emergency room, given a clot-busting drug, and the stroke was prevented before any permanent brain damage occurred. 3 days later, he was able to sit up and call his granddaughter to wish her a happy birthday as if nothing serious had ever happened. The second is Ms. Rose, 71, a widow living alone in Alabama who usually did everything around the house by herself. That evening, while preparing dinner, she felt her right hand weakening and struggled to name a familiar spice to add to the stew. She paused for a moment, then chuckled to herself, "I must be getting old, my mind's slowing down." She told no one, didn't make a call, afraid of bothering her daughter who was busy with young children. She thought she'd feel better in the morning. But that night, she collapsed in the bathroom, and her neighbor found her nearly an hour later after hearing the water running non-stop. She survived, but the right side of her body could no longer move. Now she uses a wheelchair and practices speaking each word daily with a rehabilitation specialist. I met both Mr. Charles and Ms. Rose, each with their own personality, their own circumstances, but they had one thing in common: their brains gave them early warnings. The only difference was, one trusted his instincts and acted immediately, while the other waited just one more night. And sometimes, one night is the distance between independence and a lifetime of dependence. I don't tell these stories to make you sad, but to help you realize, the difference isn't in how severe the illness is, but in when we recognize something's not right. I still think a lot about that morning with Mr. William just a few hours before he collapsed at his granddaughter's birthday party. According to his wife, that day he woke up early as usual, made his own coffee, read the newspaper, and even said, "It's a beautiful day, she must be so excited." But there was one small thing he mentioned in passing and then brushed off. He felt something odd in his mouth, as if his words weren't coming out clearly when speaking with his wife. He didn't feel pain, didn't feel tired, and nothing seemed serious enough to worry him. So he ignored it simply because the sensation felt too minor to make him stop. This always makes me wonder, if Mr. William had a small habit of checking in with his body each morning, could things have turned out differently? It was from that story that I want to share with you something that may seem simple but can make a big difference: connecting with your body every single day. Not by checking blood pressure or counting steps, but by tuning into the very subtle sensations, like the one Mr. William had but didn't quite understand. Each morning, after waking up, just sit quietly on the bed for 1 minute, close your eyes and ask yourself, do I feel anything different today? Does your head feel light? Are your limbs moving smoothly? Is your speech as clear as yesterday? These are the first signals. Then, when standing in front of the mirror to brush your teeth, try smiling slowly, say a short sentence, then raise both arms to shoulder height. If one arm feels weaker, if your smile looks uneven, or if your words stumble in an unusual way, don't dismiss those signs like Mr. William did. If he had repeated those movements once more that morning, perhaps he would have noticed, would have told his daughter, and made it to the hospital before the party. I don't say this to blame him but to remind us, sometimes the body speaks, we just haven't learned to listen at the right time. You can even jot down a few lines in a small notebook each morning. Did I speak clearly today? Is my right hand trembling? Are my eyes blurry? This isn't about tracking illness, it's about recognizing ourselves day by day, like a dear friend who never forgets us. You might even share this habit with your spouse or grandchildren. Make it a fun family routine that's also deeply helpful. Because if someone else notices a change in your voice or your face before you do, that too can be a chance to be saved. We can't change what happened to Mr. William. But from his story, we absolutely can change the way we live with our bodies every day a little slower, to listen a little more closely. I once asked many older adults who had gone through a stroke, why didn't you go to the hospital sooner? The answer usually didn't come from a lack of knowledge, but from very everyday habits and ways of thinking. One of the most common mistakes is thinking it's just temporary fatigue, that a nap will make everything better. Mr. Williams said the same thing that morning, when he felt something strange in his mouth. He didn't tell anyone, thinking, maybe I just got up too early. It'll pass. Because the feeling was so familiar, it was easy to mistake and easy to ignore. Another mistake is not wanting to bother their children, loved ones, or to call emergency services. Many older adults in America live independently, proudly, and don't want to feel like a burden in the eyes of others. But please remember, asking for help is not weakness, it's clarity and responsibility for your own well-being. I once met a 74-year-old woman who said, I was going to call my daughter, but she was at work, and I didn't want to worry her. A few hours later, she was admitted to the hospital with paralysis on one side and loss of speech. Sadly, if she had called just 2 hours earlier, she might have recovered almost completely. Another mistake is waiting for the signs to become obvious before taking action, waiting until they can't move, until their face droops, until they can't speak. But when the signs become that clear, the brain has often already been truly damaged. And the sad truth is, what's lost to a stroke isn't always something you can get back. I know many older adults are afraid of being seen as overreacting or imagining things, so they try to calm themselves and move on. But neuroscience doesn't wait for our feelings, it works in minutes and seconds. If your body is telling you something feels off, then please don't ignore it just because you're afraid of seeming overly cautious. Go ahead and be careful. Call someone. Get it checked out. Being too careful might make you feel silly for a moment, but ignoring it might cost you part of your future. And if you still think, "I felt something like this before and I was fine," then remember, luck doesn't always come around twice. Sometimes, what lingers in our hearts isn't the major events in life, but a fleeting moment we didn't pay enough attention to. A strange furrowed brow in the morning. A hand that didn't grip firmly. A slightly uneven smile in the mirror that we simply thought was tiredness. Mr. William had those moments. And if he had paused just a little longer, things might have turned out differently. But time doesn't move backward, and what has been lost is not easily regained, even if it's just a small movement on the face. That's why I hope you, those who are stepping into your 60s, 70s, or even further, will slow down a bit to truly listen to yourself. Not to be afraid, but to preserve. Not to worry about illness, but to cherish each morning we're still able to wake up in peace. Each day, if you can still smile evenly on both sides of your cheeks, still read a sentence clearly, still stretch out your arms to hug your grandchildren, then that is already something priceless. And if something in this video makes you reflect, or touches something within you, please don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with friends, with loved ones, or with anyone you care about. Because who knows, just one timely share could help someone preserve an entire healthy chapter of their life. If you've ever experienced something like Mr. William, a strange expression, a moment of hesitation in your speech, please share your story in the comments below. We are always here to listen. And sometimes, one small story of yours could become a big lesson for the entire community. If you find this video helpful, please hit like, subscribe, and stay connected with us on Thrive 60+. It's not just a place to share health information, but a space where people over 60 are respected, connected, and get to live fully. Because after 60, good health isn't just about being free from illness, it's about knowing you are still valuable, still meaningful, and still capable of making a positive difference for others. Thank you for walking with me all the way to the end of this journey that in itself is already a sign of awareness and self-love.